The Paradise Garage Show is back at last. Today we check crank oil clearance and install the bearings in the case, install the crank and rods along with the intermediate drive, and the oil pump all goes into the case. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Here I'm installing the main bearings in the case, as you see. It's a fairly simple process. Make sure though that the seats of the bearings are clean and doesn't have grease and crud on them. You don't want the bearings to rotate with the crank. Also make sure not to touch the bearing surfaces with your fingers, since fat from your fingers might make it difficult for oil to adhere to the bearing and therefore not lubricate properly. And if you get fingerprints on the bearings, make sure to wipe them off with some alcohol or maybe brake cleaner. When pushing the bearings into place, line up the notches properly and make sure that the ends are flush with the edges of the seat. Once you have the bearings installed in the two halves, it's time to mate the halves so we can measure the oil clearance for the crank. It can sometimes be a bit tricky to get the two halves go together smoothly, but with a bit of patience and not using brute force, it will work out. The trick is to, as early as possible, get the mating surfaces as parallel as possible and then carefully knock and yank them together. When getting close, I stick nuts in the four corners of the case, so I have something to work against, and hand tight them as the parts move closer together, and the nuts stop the wiggling that otherwise happens. And I use a plastic hammer to knock everything together. Finally, I tighten the nuts fairly gently to keep everything together. And as you can see, I forgot the washers first. The through bolts go in and are torqued to spec in order to get the correct clearance measurements. There's no need to put in the O-rings at this point, since it's all coming apart again, and they are not needed since no oil will be in the case. There are 11 through bolts, 24 washers, 13 golden dome nuts and 1 regular nut and washer. And why? And that's because there are 3 studs that stay in the case when split, 2 that use the same washers and nuts, and you can see 2 of them where the oil coolers sit. See that they use the same nuts as the long through bolts. The remaining stud that's in the chain housing uses a more regular nut. Talking 2 steps and just 35 Newton meters, kind of surprising I say, if you use the torques used in other engines. The second round, the money shot, or whatever you want to call it. This is why when we talk it all the way. The pattern I use here is what I found works for me. The manual says something slightly different, and with some cases you might need to experiment in case you get uneven numbers on your measurements, meaning you have to compensate for that. I checked the crank journals and they are all exactly 57 millimeter within 100ths of the millimeter. Like new, just as they're supposed to be. You shouldn't get any wear on the crank if you just take care of your engine. I get 5 to 700ths of a millimeter, which is perfect. Spec says 3 to 800ths of a millimeter clearance, and it's better to be slightly on the loose side than on the tight side. It's the smallest number that is the actual measurement here. The bore gauge is zeroed on the crank's 57 millimeter, and therefore the number you get is the actual clearance. If you look closely at the dial here, you should be able to see the numbers. It's a little bit tricky to measure the middle bearings. Hard to reach. the other 3 bearings you reach from the other side. The case is apart again. I check the intermediate spins nicely without binding and no play. So here I test fit the oil pump. That went smoothly, so let's put in the complete intermediate drive package, shaft included. And of course, oiling the bearings first. The pink stuff doesn't work all that great here, only gets pushed out, so be generous with your oil. Of course, the chains go in now as well. The shaft and the pump is a bit fiddly when you also have to deal with the chains, but just be patient and careful and get it together. Once it's all in place, you need to check that the gasket behind the oil pump is in the correct position. You see, here it came up a little bit, but went back in the correct position. I use a small boroscope camera from eBay connected to my MacBook Pro for this. Does the job. Make sure you do the inspection before you tighten the nuts on the pump and fold the ears of the locking washers. Alright, check before tighten. And then tighten the nuts. And check again. If you don't do this check, you might end up with no oil pressure and need to tear it all down again. And then might have a damaged crank and other parts. And then finally, talk to spec. Fold the ears, one up, one down. And then make sure the whole assembly rotates smoothly. I haven't shown you how to put in the oil grids over the sump. It's pretty easy, just make sure to fold the tabs over that secure the grids properly to avoid unnecessary noise. And it might actually come loose if you don't do it right. Assembly lube. This means the crank is about to go in. Don't be cheap here. Use generous amounts of lube. And I say just as the hydraulic press fins. And here we go. 3 rods go down in this half of the case. Separate them before lifting the crank into place. Remember, it can be a bit fiddly to go on properly on the pin. Let's see, here we go. The intermediate and crank kind of falls into position all by themselves. Just careful. And that's all for this time, folks. Make sure to subscribe and click the bell, etc. And like. And I see you soon.